Hello and welcome to All Indians Matter. I am Ashraf Engineer. Elections are the enabler of parliamentary democracy. They are the mechanism through which we have representation, government formation, and checks and balances on our rulers. It's how our mandates are implemented. But the mere existence of elections does not mean we have a truly representative democracy. They need to be free and fair. In India's case, a lot needs to be done by way of electoral reforms to fix problems ranging from the use of money and divisive campaigns to how mandates are twisted and cast aside through the splitting of parties. Electoral reforms are critical to remove structural flaws, clean up our politics, and, in my view, the most important of all, preserve citizens' trust in democracy. What are these reforms and how can they be implemented?
All Indians matter.
We have on the show Dr. Yugank Goyal, Associate Professor of Public Policy at Flame University, where he founded the Center for Knowledge Alternatives. The center builds online dashboards on cultures and statistics of Indian districts. Earlier, he was a founding faculty member of the O.P. Jindal Global University. He is part of the governing council of the Indian School of Public Policy and also regularly consults government on public policy research and design. Yugank's research publications engage with new institutional economics, law and development, informal markets, and of late, psephology. He studied engineering in India and pursued his master's and PhD in law and economics in Europe as an Erasmus Mundus Fellow. Recently, Yugank, along with Arun Kumar Kaushik, authored the book Who Moved My Vote. The authors dug through data from India's national and state election results to show how the system creates leakages in its mandates, its returns, and why the whole apparatus needs radical reform. Welcome, Yugank.
Thank you so much, Ashraf. Thank you so much for having me over on the show.
Yugank, does India have truly free and fair elections? If yes, why? And if no, why?
My God, we have heard this a great deal already, right? Haven't we? I think it's interesting that you asked this because free and fair are often they go together, but they need not necessarily do so. In fact, we should look at elections as a two-step process. The process one is where people are going out, they're casting their votes, and process two is when they become subject to their own decisions, right? When the government formation happens and so on and so forth. So I think in the first case, yes, I think there is a fair element. I mean, barring a few instances of skirmishes, of disturbances at the polling booths, by and large, Indian state has been able to conduct free and fair elections on the ground, on the polling booths, since 1952, right? And that has been a remarkable success, I would say, given its own limitations, given its own. I could put on footnotes some of these things, why we still need to make them better, but by and large, they have been successful. What has not been, however, free and fair is how people have been subjected to their own decision making, because once these votes get aggregated in New Delhi or in Lucknow or in Chennai, a lot of manipulation with these votes, aggregation of one party's votes with the other take place, and often people receive the type of mandate that they never intended to in the first place. And if you include that as part of the election process, the government formation itself, I'm not sure if we have had a free and fair elections all through. We know hundreds of such examples. So conducting elections, by and large, I will vote in favor of it. Politically speaking, vote in favor of it. But otherwise, not as much.
No, I think that's a very interesting point, Yugank. In fact, there's a general sense that it does not matter whether you vote or not, and in many cases, whether the party chosen is installed. And what I mean by that is that no matter who the people choose, they can be toppled through the buying of MLAs or other means. Why has this happened, and what does its state say about the state of our democracy?
Oh, this is fascinating. I mean, this is brilliant what you're asking. I mean, I'm in Maharashtra, and we know what happened here a few months ago. In fact, in Himachal Pradesh, election results that were just released 2 days ago, they were all talking about Congress has to protect its MLAs because BJP is going to come and buy them out, even though BJP has lost it. And the travesty which we have made.
This is in a situation. There is a strong mandate.
There is a strong mandate. Yeah, exactly.
For 40 MLAs for Congress, 25 for BJP. Despite that, it's not secure enough.
No, so this is a relegation. I mean, we have relegated our democracy to a concept of MLA and MP buying and selling. In fact, there's an interesting terminology that scholars and even journalists talk about it. They call it resort politics. You pack all your MPs and MLAs and take them to a resort so that they're cut off from the other parties' connections entirely. But frankly, this has been, in our view, and this is one of the things that we have also written in our book, which is that our idea of democracy really comes from various layers. We have constitutional democracy. We have a constitution. but we also equally have an electoral democracy. And so while constitutional democracy might be flourishing, it is not necessary that electoral democracy is too. And they both need not go hand in hand. So, in some ways, when people vote and there is a pre-poll coalition done, right? So let's say BJP and Janata Dal have formed a pre-poll coalition like they did in 1989. Then when people are going to vote, they know fairly well that if I'm voting for BJP, I'm equally responsible for having Janata Dal chief minister or prime minister come into the power as well, because they both have a coalition. And so that's in a way okay. MP and MLAs forming coalitions before the elections. What's really not okay, and where the trust in democracy really gets eroded, is when people vote for one party, whereas later on another party, by buying and sale of various MPs and MLAs, come to power, including parties of their own choice. So they break their pre-poll coalition and join you. I mean, something like that happened in Bihar, for instance. And I don't think this is desirable. But let me also add here, Ashraf, because this is an important question we may want to, pick up, or people should pick it up at some other time, which is that how much have we really cared about who is in power as Indians? And this is not just reflected from the low levels of voting behavior that we have, for instance, 50, 60%, but also historically so. Right. So to give you an example, in 1952, the first ever elections, Congress party got the largest number of votes, which is almost 45% of the total votes. Do you know the second largest number of votes actually went to independent candidates, not to a political party? Which is to say that what we really care, I mean, as Indians, what we really care about is who is our immediate leader, who's going to take care of my affairs in my municipality, my parliamentary constituency, or my legislative assembly constituencies. I am less concerned with what happens in Delhi, or for that matter in my state capital. You backtrack this across history and you will realize we were less concerned about who's taking care of New Delhi. I mean, British were able to rule this place because they were able to, allow these kingdoms to exist, who would give them the share of their revenues and taxes. And so there were more than 500 princely states in India. So this idea of sovereignty does not come in the same way to us as it comes to, let's say, a European, about some central power out there in Delhi who we are all concerned about. And this is important because this is not going to be the subject of our conversation perhaps today, or even for that matter for most people in political science discourses. But we should look at how do we see it. In fact, I'll tell you one more interesting thing we found out doing research for our book. There's a lot of conversation on simultaneous elections. So the idea is that if you have Lok Sabha and Vidhan Sabha elections held in the same year or close to each other, people might be influenced and they might vote for the same party in Vidhan Sabha who they voted for Lok Sabha. But when we looked at the results of Lok Sabha, Vidhan Sabha of the same state happening close to each other, we found massive divergences. In other words, people may have wanted party X in New Delhi, but the same party did not repeat in their own state. Which means people are really concerned. Indian voters, and it appears to us, are concerned about what is closest to them geographically, emotionally, I don't know, psychologically. And that is why these, MPs and MLAs being sold and purchased does not raise the type of, I would say, anger in people as much as I would expect or you would expect, right? That said, I think it is undesirable because politicians play with the trust of voters. An entire chapter that we've dedicated on coalition politics actually talks about this. It is epidemic now. It started in the 80s and 90s, and now it has become so common. In fact, it happened even before that, frankly. And so, it's disappointing because clearly, if you read the Constituent Assembly debates, this was not what Ambedkar or the founding fathers of the Constitution ever envisaged. In fact, the accountability of political parties towards their voters. I mean, at some level, the fact that we have become okay with it, or the fact that this has become normal, the way they were talking about after Himachal elections, is a cause for worry. This normalcy is a cause for worry indeed.
Yeah, absolutely. And that cynicism that you spoke about, I think that's a whole different episode altogether. But
Yes.
Yugank, do you think our first past the post system is the correct one for us? And also, before you answer that, you should explain to our listeners in a nutshell what that system is.
Oh yeah, surely. Let me explain what first past the post system is, FPTP as they call it. So it's basically like a race. How do you win a race in, let's say, in athletics? Whoever passes the post first gets to be the winner. Even if the guy on who came second was a microsecond behind this guy, the winner takes all. Like this guy is a winner, and everybody's looking at this guy. So those guys who come second, third, fourth really don't matter. Which basically means In an electoral or in any aggregation of preferences, it doesn't matter if you have voted, I mean, how many votes you receive. What matters is if you have received one more vote than the second guy, and that's good enough. So the margins don't matter in FPTP. And why is that important? Well, think about it. Let's say there are 10 people who are contesting, I don't know, let's say your classroom, right, in your university or college. There are 10 guys who are contesting elections and 100 people have to vote for them. And let's say almost all of them are almost equally liked, right? So each one is getting 10 votes and so on and so forth. One guy gets 9 votes and another guy gets 11. The guy with 11 votes out of 100 is going to run the show for all 100 students. So this is first past the post. You don't need 50%. All you need is one more than the second guy. And so this means it's really a number game. It's not really gaining or earning the trust of majority of the population. It is gaining and earning the trust of number of people, one more than the second guy. Why is that a problem? Well, because think about it. You can win an election with just 11 people in a 100 people classroom, like I just gave you an example. Let me give you another example, which might be easier.
In theory, essentially, is that 89% of the electorate may have voted against you,
exactly,
but you still win.
So what you're looking at is somebody who's liked the most, but not somebody who's hated the least. And the point we're trying to make is somebody who's liked the most is not always the guy who's hated the least. And we need to think about who do we really want? The guy who's liked by the most, even though hated by most, or hated by even more people, or a guy who's hated the least overall. Think about you and I contesting elections in 3 constituencies. Let's say each of them have 100 voters. You win in A and B, and I win in the third constituency C. You get to form the government. But let's say your victory was 51-49 in both, and your loss was 0-100 in the third. You've got overall 102 votes. But I have got 49 plus 49 plus 100, which is 198 votes. I've got double your votes, but you still get to form the government. And if you are wondering, Yugank, this is all textbook explanation, mathematically this makes sense, but in reality we're talking about millions of people. Surely this should be happening on the ground. Well, it is. I mean, we've given a number of examples. 2004 was one such example. And I'll give you one more. Kerala, in particular, from 1957 to 1980s, all their elections, the winning party had lesser number of votes than the losing party. All of them. And we're talking about Kerala, which is, of course, politically very, quote unquote, aware and conscious state in some ways. And so this is why I think, first past the post system is not the ideal choice that we have adopted in many countries in the world in various types of elections. Our president is not chosen through first past the post system. In a board meeting, in a corporate boardroom, first past the post system is not the thing to go by. In our families, when we vote for which particular restaurant we want to go to, we don't choose it by first past the post system. So when you aggregate the preferences of so many people, FPTP doesn't really stand aside as one of the best ways of deciding. It's the easiest, yes. And Ambedkar was aware of these things, but he said, look, it's difficult for different types of voting systems to be implemented on an Indian populace which has very little literacy rate. But I think we have come to a stage where we can now think about it, with more and more literacy, but also awareness about politics, rising.
Yeah. Also reminds me of the election between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. Again,
exactly.
Hillary won more votes aggregate.
Exactly.
But Donald Trump, because of the collegium
yes.
that they go by in America. So it makes you wonder whether there is a perfect electoral system.
Yeah, exactly. And India is not the only one suffering from it. I mean, many countries have figured out the problems in first past the post system. It's just that we have a historical, there's a path dependency to it. And of course, these reforms will take constitutional amendments. And so it's a difficult, tall order, but not something we should not be talking about because it affects all of us in ways unimaginable.
What about the runoff system, where just for the benefit of listeners, if it's a very close election, then the top 2 contenders again stand for election from the same constituency and people vote again between those 2?
Correct. No, this happens in France. So French presidents are elected through this system.
In France, exactly.
Yeah. And by the way, I think it was Jacques Chirac and one more person. I have to look it up. When this guy, I think Jacques Chirac was the second in the list after the first round, and in the second round he actually won the election because many people whose votes had gone to the losers, they had to re-poll now, and they thought Chirac was better than the guy who won the election in the first round. Of course, it's costly because you have to do it twice, but you reduce the likelihood of votes getting wasted. So runoff systems exactly do this. They try to make use of all the votes, try to make use of most votes or at least definitely more worse than first past the post system. So if I voted to a losing party, all those votes have gone waste, like they've gone down the drain really. But that doesn't happen in runoff and many other types of systems that that you're aware of. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, especially in a fragmented political system like India, where a lot of votes would be taken away because of caste-based parties or regional parties and so on. And if
Exactly.
there's a runoff, you might actually land up with very different election results. But anyway, I want to come back, Yugank, to the election system and specifically the election commission. But there is a strong sense today that the election commission is not neutral. There is so much hate speech, so many violations, so many doubts about the counting process, and these are simply not addressed. How did we get to this place?
Yeah, I think we have been there mostly, except for the time of TN Session and a few others, frankly. I think this is not the case with you see a general erosion of institutional structures or institutions, public institutions in India anyway happening, and globally actually happening around the world. And so this might be, a moment of reflection and moment of reckoning in terms of where have we reached. But frankly, my answer to this question would be something that I also often say in my class, which is it really depends on who the person is and the leadership potential this person has. I've been reading some of these statute books, and I realized one of the reasons why people like TN Session were able to stand out from other election commissioners in making extremely unpopular decisions mandated, even at the annoyance of ruling parties, is because they were able to make use of certain clauses in the statute books which favor them. So if you look at the rule book, election commissioners have wide ranging powers. They really cannot be bullied or asked to be influenced by the ruling party. And so it really depends on the person himself or herself, how much he or she would be willing to make use of the powers vested under the constitution or under the statutes to him or her, and not be a victim to some sort of you scratch my back, I scratch yours game that we often see. And therefore we can actually extend this discussion even beyond election commission. So if, for instance, ruling parties, ruling governments, there are carrots and sticks that they can offer to election commission. So they will self-select the person in such a way because they want to control it, right? All of this said, Ashraf, deep down in my own reading and understanding of electoral processes, you are right. They may not have, taken strong, stands against many of the violations that were perceived to us as something which should have been picked up. But by and large, their conduct during elections have been fairly unblemished in a big way. So while pre-poll campaign advertisements are, areas where election commissions may have faltered, during the poll, they have followed scrupulously the details by and large. And I'm saying this by and large with a sense of responsibility because recognizing the size of this country and organizing this massive machinery of electoral elections is itself a tall order. And in that sense, I think for as long as the election commissioner's selection is dependent on the ruling party or ruling government, we are going to continue to see these type of things, not just in election commission, but even beyond. And so what is really needed is that the appointment of people who run the show in these institutions is done in a manner in which the government themselves have only limited role. And my worry is that no matter which party comes to power, this is going to become, a habit of every political party because they've seen the benefits of doing this and the cost of not doing it.
Yeah, you're right. And what do you suggest? I mean, do you think there should be a collegium like the way Supreme Court judges are selected, or how do you make an electoral election commission not just truly non-partisan, but also seem to be non-partisan, which is equally important, I think.
I think one of the reasons why we still continue to have an independent judiciary is because the system is rather formulaic. There is a formula. This is the guy who's going to come into the picture. There's no other party. There's no political party or ruling government that may have any influence on it, which is unlike how it happens in the US, right? By the way, where the judges are appointed at the interest of the president themselves. But both systems have their own merits and demerits. So I would say this system might as well work in election commission's case better because the electoral reforms, are less dependent on who the election commissioner is, but more dependent on how consensus is built around it because the stakes are too high, right? And so even if an election commissioner is appointed on a formula, and he's, for instance, Supreme Court Chief Justice can stay in his position only for a month and leave because the formula is telling him that, look, now you have to leave and this new guy is going to come. Recently that happened with Justice UU Lalit. That type of a system in election commission can also work because there is an institutional continuity in election commission which can continue even if the top guy keeps changing very regularly. Unlike in the Supreme Court, where I think judicial reforms don't take place because the Chief Justice don't really stay for a long time. The additional trick here is that people who join election commission at the highest position should not carry, should be, this can go for not just election commissions but even others, debarred from joining any other government commission for the next several years. So there's a cooling off period. Of course, we have cooling off period in India for many positions, but it's really too short. And that, in fact, for the benefit of some of the audiences, I'll narrate an incident. I was in South Korea and I met a constitutional court judge who was retired. And I asked him, are you now part of some commission here, or, are you heading some, doing some part of the government as you're retired? And his answer surprised me. He said, of course, what are you talking, Yugank? I can't do that. It will be considered very unethical if I go back to the government in any capacity. Any administrative capacity. I've retired as a judge, so I have to remain now. I go to universities and talk. That's what I do. I mean, think about this in India, right? And so that really reduces the
incentive. In India, of course, the Supreme Court Chief Justice can go to the Rajya Sabha.
Exactly, like you know what I'm talking about. So I think that's important. I think we have to arrest the tendency or arrest the incentive for public servants to evergreen their career, because they will always remain at the mercy of the ruling government, because they are the ones who will appoint them. Or even for that matter, we need to insulate them so that there is no harm that comes to them either, right? So this is, this is like a short bit. Of course, this is something that I haven't thought as deeply because, as I said, by and large, at least the conduct of elections is fairly, relatively devoid of complaints, like major complaints from people at large. And in that sense, I would kind of, absolve election commission relatively compared to many other institutions where erosion is a lot more actually.
What about the use of money power? How do we curb that during elections? I mean, we know it happens. Absolutely, I doubt there is a single candidate, or there would be very, very few candidates across India who would actually be adhering to the limits specified.
Yeah, no, this it's a crazy one actually. In fact, by some back of the envelope calculations, some people estimated in 2014 the amount of money spent in campaign elections and campaign finance in India was almost the same as much as they spent in the electoral contest between Trump and Hillary. The figures ran to up to 5 trillion. I mean, it was unbelievably astronomical sum. And I often talk about this, even in my classes, in terms of why do Indians have so much to gain by paying political parties? Like, why do we pay the political parties such high level of high amount of money? And here's an interesting answer that kind of I have figured out. I'm still doing some research on it, but I'll throw the tidbits here, just to trigger some, conversations around. So if you look at the top companies in India by market capital or by revenues, the name of the companies that will come to your mind would be Tata Consulting Services, Reliance Industries Limited, maybe Wipro, L&T for sure, HDFC Limited, and so on and so forth, right? And if you look at the top 5 companies in the US, the companies that come to our mind are companies like Alphabet, which is Google's parent company, Amazon, Microsoft, Facebook, and Apple, of course. Now, what is the difference between these two companies? Here's an interesting difference. Almost all the companies in India, which are the big ones, rely on government for their part of their revenues because they carry huge government contracts and tenders. Almost zero. I mean, I think none of these companies that I mentioned in the US rely on government for part of their revenues. In other words, in my view, and there's some work that I've done on this, given the amount of money that is involved in public procurement, tenders, that amount of money incentivizes firms and companies to be close to the government, whichever government is in power, because they need those contracts for their own survival. The public procurement, which is all tenders, whether it's a stationery in a government office to building huge bridges and dams, all of those tenders are perhaps some of the most important promises on which democracies rely on, but hardly talked about, particularly in India. In most European countries, the amount of public procurement that these countries do, that in terms of how much they buy from the market, is around 10-15% of the total GDP. In India, some very rough calculations suggest this goes up to 25% of GDP. So Indian governments procure enormously. And we know, despite The notwithstanding, I mean, we can call it, there is a huge amount of cosmetic compliance that Indian governments do before they sell a tender, right? There's a huge process, there's a whole bidding thing, and there are all kinds of crazy contracting. But we know effectively engaging with the government, there are ways in which these tenders can be manipulated. There are ways in which, certain companies get the tenders, and even though they have to outsource it to another one, right? And I'm not saying it happens all the time, but it happens, extensively. And I know personally because I've done a lot of research on this with some of my students. We're working on it. And so this means in some ways, I often talk to my friends that, true liberalization really hasn't happened in India because the government still controls all the resources. And if the government controls all the resources, obviously you want to be close to them. And if you want to be close to them, the best way to do that is to give them money during political campaigns, including, in fact, give money to both the parties, because whoever comes to power, you want. I mean, why would a businessman want to join politics in any country? Think about it. This guy is super busy doing his own, I mean, countries like India, Russia, many of these countries have businessmen joining politics full time. So the chairman or the founder of a company is actually a member of parliament or a member of legislative assembly. And there is some research happening in some universities trying to figure this very unique phenomenon out. I would not have time if I'm running a company. How can I do politics? That means politics must be beneficial to me, isn't it? Otherwise, I would probably just pay money. I mean, it is so beneficial that I don't even trust in paying money to somebody. I will myself go and become a member of parliament. I mean, that's how much of rent you could potentially see from there. And so this is where.
But Yugank, I found that insight absolutely fascinating. The difference between India's most valued companies and, let's say, the US's most valued companies, and you're right, they seem to be infrastructure, power,
Exactly.
financial services companies. It's just
Oil and
fascinating,
natural gas for
the
that matter.
insight.
So all these rent thick sectors. In fact, recent research shows that the number of billionaires we have added in the last 10 to 20 years, in fact, maybe more, are predominantly coming from rent thick sectors. Unlike in many other countries where they come from, some of these startup industries where technology, etc., is, they're not rent thick, for example. So you're right. There's a sector. Sorry to cut you there, but please go ahead.
No, 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 not at all. But in keeping with this line of conversation, what about the vast number of representatives with criminal records? That doesn't seem to bar them from getting into parliament or state assemblies.
Yes. So, I mean, I will have to probably go back to the point I was earlier making. How much do we really care about the representatives, moral high ground, for instance? Surely this is not a desirable idea because somebody with high level of criminal records is likely to be more morally depraved compared to another person. But the deeper question is, why do we elect them? They must be offering some patronage to a large share of vote banks. So one of the ways in which this system works is that you create shortages and offer patronage, in a piecemeal fashion. The more patronage you offer, the more votes you receive. So they become like your, incentives that you're offering to people to vote for you. And because you offer those incentives, people vote for you, disregarding what is your character otherwise looking like, whether you've been involved in, criminal activity or not. Don't we think we need to go deeper into understanding how we think about who should be the member of parliament or the leader in Delhi or Bhopal? Because they all come from within us. We should have this conversation really intensely. If you tell me these guys are contesting elections, how do we allow them to contest elections? But the problem is they're not just contesting elections, they are winning. And if they are winning, then that is done by people. Right? So people themselves go out and vote for the so-called convicts. So that means Indian voter is looking for something else. Or maybe they probably don't even care about this. Like I mentioned earlier, right? How much do we understand sovereignty? Do we understand the idea of sovereignty or the idea of elections in the same way that a European does? And that is a bigger question to think about.
If I'm understanding you right, what you're saying is that our idea of sovereignty is directly linked to the question of electoral reforms.
I think, yeah, that's a good way to put it. In fact, I don't even know how do we understand, sovereignty. When British came here, they found millions of rajas. I mean, millions is of course an exaggeration, but you know what I'm talking about. And they were all ruling these little hamlets, little village there. Yahan par this, there's fascinating movie called Newton, right? It shows us, there's this big leader of that tribal community, and that's the guy who they're really going to talk to.
Yeah.
I mean, they will vote for whoever, and this is not an exaggeration. You and I are not very different from the type of tribal communities that were shown in the movie, except that of course we have educated, we have kind of we have been exposed to the world a lot more. But historically, If you look at the path dependent process through which we are going, moving ahead, we are stuck in a certain type of thinking about state. How do we understand state? How does an Indian understand state is very different from how a European understands state. We never had Treaty of Westphalia. We never had the glorious revolution that England had. We never had the tax bargain that England had to go through. We never had those type of parliaments. This does not mean that we were a very passive receivers of what was going on with us. There are all kinds of cases of rebellions against the rajas. In fact, Indians would kidnap the rajas and install their own raja, in small villages. There are all kinds of historical records that indicate this, which means we have to look at it relatively slightly differently, and might be outside the point of conversation that we are having in terms of electoral reforms. But I think still a point worth pondering: how is it possible that a guy with range of criminal records against him or her is able to win? It's not just contest. Contesting is something we can discuss. Is able to win the elections. That means people must be thinking very differently. How is it the other guy who's a clean guy not able to win there? Probably, it's a mental model. It's a framework in which we think, and in that framework, maybe there's not a surprise. I don't know.
Yeah, maybe the thought that he's our criminal. I don't know. Comes from us, like you say, comes from our community or our region or whatever. But Yugang, there's another serious issue here in our campaigns, which is the increasing use of jingoism, the increasing use of divisions along religious communal lines. What about that?
So I think we should look at the delta. Has it come down? Has it gone up? And I think let's assume it has gone up. Why would it be going up? It's come down. Why is it coming down? Because these type of jingoism, communal ideas, or group-driven identity formations for politics is a phenomenon globally. Psychologists have written about it. People affiliate to their group identities a lot more, and so therefore this will also come into the picture in electoral politics also. Many countries have been able to resolve those problems. Some of them have not been able to. We have not been able to. So the big deeper. So that's like psychology tells us this will happen. Deeper question is: are we getting better at it, or are we getting worse? If we are getting worse, then my answer to this question would be hinged on the crazy rise of social media, where immature WhatsApp university information and instructions often influence minds, not just of young voters but even of old ones, where narrative building and narrative formation has now taken a very, very different route. Earlier, when the information was not so freely available, people would often converge around some village elders. They would often talk to some, they would form groups, they would chit chat, they would debate, they would argue. Maybe they would go to a school teacher in a village and ask them, who should we vote for this in this panchayat? What do you think? We need this. Who do you think is a good guy? And all of that is now no longer needed, because the same villager is going to get a WhatsApp forward in which he will read Nehru Ji to Muslim Day, right, and all of those type of things. Now these type of narrative building will create more and more communal. I mean, think about what's going on with Facebook. Facebook didn't know the type of monster they have released. We would have thought that with more people coming and talking and chatting with each other, more and more ideas will be shared. But like Gandhi used to say, bad news always travels faster than the good news. So only the bad ideas are going to spread far more rather than the good ideas. It takes a lot more effort for goodness to spread in some sense. In fact, if you look at the use of what type of websites are most used and what type of purposes for which these are used, we are not going to be very happy about the results. So the rise of social media has fanned the fire of communal attitudes and jingoistic attitudes in electoral politics, particularly in India, where the screening mechanisms for what news is good or bad is not done at individual level. For most, I mean, there are many people who are still illiterate in many ways. I mean, forget about illiterate. I mean, we don't have good universities. So critical thinking, which is typically taught in universities, takes time in India to spread its wings. And I'm saying this with a sense of responsibility, because in the entire book we have argued how Indians are very smart in voting. We can't say that this is not like a patronizing argument that Indians don't know how to vote for. But quite clearly, you can influence somebody who's less exposed more easily than somebody who is more exposed. Now, let me end this by saying we have strong laws about what newspapers can publish, what TV channels can speak. I mean, people can file cases against them if they are writing anything false. We don't have those laws against you and me sitting on the dinner table and me telling you some false story about some political leader. What will you do? You'll just probably stop believing me next time. That's the max you can do. But no longer I am just talking to you. With this telephone, I have become a newspaper by myself because I can viral this thing to millions of people who will viral to millions of people. And I am not bound by the laws of ethics that otherwise print media is bound by. And so you are then effectively converting dinner table conversations all across the internet, going to millions of people who may have less exposure in order to critically analyze what you have said. And this is only going to create, I highly recommend reading Hind Swaraj, in which Gandhi spoke so eloquently about the type of culture that we have and what are the things that we should be wary about. And, bad news travels faster than the good news. And so this is assuming the communal nature of our politics has gone up, which I think you'll agree with. If you think it has gone down, then I would say it has gone down. Probably the argument will be turned on its head, right? Exactly the opposite, which is that more Indians are now far more mature to separate fact from fiction, and they're actually not voting on the lines of communal arguments. So, to give you an example, there are places where people who were otherwise not be. So let's assume, or let's say, for argument's sake, if we assume that Muslims don't vote for BJP, and we find that Muslim majority places BJP candidates are winning, that means these guys may have gone beyond their communal affiliations and still voted for BJP, probably because I don't know, the ladies were of that village were very happy with Ujjwala Yojana, for example. I don't know. So there, this question becomes an empirical one. Maybe in some parts we have become less communal in our electoral decision making. In some other parts, we have not. If we have not, that's largely because of social media influencing young or not young, less exposed minds. Let me put it this way. And on the other, the social media doing exactly, or not just social media in general. The growth and the education, etc., is doing exactly the opposite.
Yeah. Electoral funding now, Yugank.
Yes.
Now, there's been a lot of talk of that. We've also touched upon it to some extent. And now we have these electoral bonds. What do you think of them?
Course. My God. So, how should I put it? So, at one level, if I have to make an argument by saying that, look, people were funding political parties anonymously even earlier. In fact, they were funding it in cash. So, if we think that the purpose of electoral bonds was to arrest the cash transactions, maybe it was a good idea. But if the purpose of electoral bonds was enhancing and improving transparency in electoral financing, then it has actually done worse because of one very tricky, interesting reason, which is often not discussed. So people talk about anonymity, but what they don't talk about is that there is only one bank, which is State Bank of India, where you can do this. And State Bank of India is government bank, which means whichever government is going to be in power will know who are funding the opposition parties. And that, to me is like a big surprise. Even though, one might tell me like, well, this, Congress party can also make use of this provision when they come to power because they will know who's funding the BJP. So this is not only in favor of BJP. It seems to me that it will favor the party which is in power. And that I don't think is a good idea. And of course, I am not particularly a big fan of the idea of anonymity. I think electoral bonds have done precisely the opposite of what they were perhaps, claimed to be achieving. But from a less cynical view, I would say it was not any better earlier anyway. I have a feeling it is going to make electoral financing even more voluminous, even more valuable, because earlier there was a limit on how much a company can donate. Like there's so much a percentage of your total profit, net profits over the last 3 years that you can pay. I think it was 7.5% or something. Now you don't even have that limit, right? And because it is anonymous, the board of directors will also not know. I mean, board of directors will probably know, but I don't think shareholders will ever know who did my company finance, and so on and so forth. So in that sense, I think it's a horrible idea. But in the sense of arresting cash transactions, maybe not that bad an idea. So, but I don't think arresting cash transaction.
That I don't think was the purpose.
Promise, exactly. The purpose was a lot more is transparency, and I think it's a surprise actually that we can have these things fly.
Yeah. Do you think this government is interested in fixing an electoral process that seems to have worked very well for it?
I don't think any government who comes to power will want to change it because that's the system through which they came to power, right? In the first place. So no one knows the cost of what will happen. So let's say we move to a proportional representation system. Frankly, it is very difficult to model who is going to win in that game. And because the stakes are too high, the governments will not take a chance. Because they have understood the system, they have mastered the system. But what the governments could do potentially is to tweak and create minor reforms, right? In my view, for instance, reforming how election commission is constructed itself will be a major reform in this space, which I don't know whether this government would be interested in doing. But another reform could be the idea of simultaneous election. I personally think simultaneous election is indeed a good idea, and that is something that this government would be interested in. So it really depends on the micro reforms within the larger frame of electoral reforms that could potentially take place. And some of them the government will do because they think they will be in its favor, but they will also favor any other party when they come to power in future. Some of them they will not do because they think it will not be in its favor. And the answer is mixed. By and large, I am not particularly very hopeful, but at the same time, I wasn't really very hopeful even in the previous government either, in that sense. So my money will be on smaller reforms rather than big reforms, even though I wish big reforms take place.
So, Yugank, tell us about your book. How did you think of it, and what was the process of putting it together?
Well, thanks. Thanks for asking this, Ashram. I think primarily I am an economist, right? And I law and economics largely is my area of study. With my former colleague in Jindal, Arun Kaushik, we both did our PhD together.
Before you proceed, I must think. This analogy comes to mind. Just as in cricket, fast bowlers think they are great batsmen too. I find that economists think that they are also great at everything, including physiology. But it's just a joke. I don't want to offend any economists out
Yeah,
there.
I mean, this is a cricket smelly. This was a Yorker ball to an economist, right? This was a ball under the belt. But look, I am an extremely outspoken self-critic in terms of my profession and what economists have done to the world. So I will perfectly enjoy having this
Yeah.
conversation with you, of
Yeah, no,
course.
but on a more serious note,
Hmm.
on a more serious note, that was a joke, of course.
No, no,
But
of
on a more
course.
serious
Please
note, I
go.
think economics gives you the kind of perspective of human behavior, of human motivations, of human psychology. I would say that very few other streams of academia actually do. And I think that's why economists are such good predictors of social upheaval, such good observers of what happens in society. It's not just about money and numbers and statistics.
No, but I mean, I'm not sure if I will put economists on that pedestal. You were very kind in this, on your serious note. I think surely economists like to think how you're thinking, but whether they're able to do it and achieve it in the same way is a question in the open. I think the world would be better off with less economists. Frankly, the World Bank would be better off with less bankers in some sense. But then, of course, that's for another day. So with Arun, so Arun and I, we used to teach in Jindal earlier. I am now at Flame. Arun stays is still there. Arun and I did our PhD together, and our PhDs were on very different topics, and we were just talking about the recently held elections in 2014, and we were looking at some numbers, and we realized these gaps and leakages of first past the post system that I just mentioned to you in a few of the electoral data that we had. Arun had earlier worked a little bit on it, but I had never done that. And this seemed fascinating to both of us. And so we started writing a few papers around it. Few of them were published in Economic and Political Weekly, EPW. Some of them came out in as opinion pieces in various newspapers. And based on the feedback that we received, we thought there is a story to tell here, which is a larger story on psephology. Indian political science departments rarely engage with psephology or data analysis of electoral results, something which is very, very routine in Western universities. And so we thought, is there a case for writing a very lucid, description demonstrating very, accessibly to people, Indian voters, what happens with the results? Why is it and how is it that the votes get wasted? How are the votes sort of manipulated, pushed from one side to the other? What goes on after the elections are over? And so we picked up election results data only. We didn't pick up any exit poll results. We didn't pick up any subjective opinions of political pundits. We just looked at the data. So you can clear out the name of the parties and the name of the constituencies and just show us the data. We'll come to similar results. And then when we replant the political parties and constituencies, we're up for surprises. And so we thought, let's build a story and at least introduce readers to what is psephology and why they should be doing more of it. The political pundits who talk in television channels, write in newspapers, must look at it this way. And a lot of things have changed after the introduction of EVMs. And this is something I should have mentioned earlier. Electronic voting machine, which is by the way very rare. Most European countries don't go with EVMs. They have a paper ballot.
No, even the US.
Here in the US, correct, correct. And I'll tell you what's happening with EVMs. So with EVMs, political parties have booth level data with them. In this booth, how many votes came to me and how many votes went to these guys, not constituency level, because you have a booth level EVM. This means I can really micromanage my campaign the next year Because in a booth I know this mohalla is full of Hindus and Muslims or Dalits or whatever, and this mohalla must not have voted for me, this mohalla must have voted, this is the mohalla where I really need to focus. And so this means I can really do target advertising and ensure that at booth level I am able to win. So and you aggregate it all, as long as you are winning more than the second guy, you're done with that. So in some sense it has made campaign consultants very very important, consultants who work on numbers. And that is why I thought this book is even more relevant, because we want ordinary people to understand this, people and rather untrained audience. So what we did was we looked at the Lok Sabha results, Lok Sabha data from so for instance we all know that Congress party was decimated in 1977, but do you know they were actually victorious in all the four South Indian states, victorious. Or for that matter, like I mentioned about the independent candidates in 1952. So all kinds of interesting surprises across Lok Sabha elections, women participation, participation of Muslim candidates, so on and so forth. And then we looked at a few Vidhan Sabha elections. We looked at UP, we looked at Bihar, we looked at Bengal, and we looked at Kerala. And we also pulled out a number of very powerful and very useful mathematical equations, mathematical metrics that tell us how disproportionate the election results are, how much was the leakage, how tough was the electoral competition, and how tough we can assess it by calculating how many parties were there effectively. I mean, 70-80% parties will not matter, but some of them will matter. How much did they really matter? And is electoral competition going up in the state or going down in the state, disproportionality going up, going down, and so on and so forth. And we explain them extremely in easy language. There's a chapter on coalition politics. There is one chapter on the rise of BJP. This chapter, we looked at votes and seats got by BJP since 1984 across various states, across Lok Sabha, across Vidhan Sabha, and it's quite insightful just to see how is BJP faring in a specific state since then, in votes as well as in seats. And like I explained to you earlier, the first past the post system has a potential to create huge discrepancy between seats received and votes received. There are interesting insights. And one long chapter in the end is on electoral reforms, where we discuss not just the Constituent Assembly debates and what happened to our electoral systems after that, but also a point that you mentioned, right? Instant runoff voting. And what are the other type of voting methods that potentially could be employed. So this is in a nutshell the whole book. And really the hope is, that more people do psephology.
Yeah. And does the book suggest any solutions to fix the electoral process?
The suggestions and solutions have come in form of principles rather than in form of on the ground what has to be done. Because on the ground, constitutional amendment will have to take place perhaps, right? So yes, it offers a range of options in terms of what type of electoral methods could be adopted. One in particular we have gone deeper into. But I think how exactly it could be done on the ground logistically is a matter of discussion and debate for probably another one. But yeah, I mean, it's more to trigger thinking about where we are.
Yeah. So you can't tell us about your work other than the book.
Well, I think I'll very briefly mention one of the most exciting things that I am now currently doing and I've ever done in my life actually is, so I moved to Flame University to set up the Center for Knowledge Alternatives. And what we do in the center is that we document district level statistics and cultures and create a massive dashboard around it. You may know about the district gazetteers that the British used to write in India when they were ruling us. These were like voluminous, big, huge documents in which they would map out the entire territory, district by district, talking about everything that you could potentially think about, right? And they were masters at documentation. They would write, of course, in hugely racist language, but who could have stopped them at that time? This gazetteer writing is in a way kind of in a disrepair after independence. The Indian government in the independent India hasn't really taken care of it as much as they should have. And I think that's where the inspiration really comes from. So you know a lot about India, and maybe you know a lot about Mumbai or Delhi or I don't know, Bangalore. But how much do you know about Muradabad or Guntur or Osmanabad or Kutch, right? And these are the districts which are, and Indian districts are huge. So if you were to find out how many cars are there in Mumbai, you can really find it out on the click of a mouse. But how many cars are there in Satara? It's difficult. Like you have to go to the RTO office to find this information out. And even as you want to set up a mechanic shop, car mechanic shop, it'll be nice for you to know this information. The local district magistrates or collectors would want to use this information. And local cultures, which are getting vanished as we speak, old grandmother stories So we just thought we'll document them. So we have started doing this. We have done our pilot in 3-4 districts. And that is, of course, one important work that I do. But other than that, some research work that I do in development economics, and also, little bit in rural education, something which is something I'm a little passionate about. But yeah, this, I think I don't want to, lengthen this answer anyway.
No, no. In fact, that was going to be my next question. You recently co-founded a school in western rural Uttar Pradesh. Tell us about that.
Thanks, Ashraf, for asking that. With some of our friends, we during COVID we got this kind of we heard this voice that we need to do something. I mean, COVID was a moment of self-reflection for so many people. I mean, the trigger had really begun even before that, but that's when we kind of got together and we thought we should do something. And there's this village in a district called Sambal. So Sambal is a district that was carved out of Badaयूं and Moradabad in western UP, and really 3 hours from Delhi, but you may say maybe 100 years behind, right? In India, we travel in time; we don't travel in distances often, right? And we often go back,
That's true. Yeah.
or so it's an interesting country. You can see 21st century, in fact, 22nd century technology here, and just at a stone's throw distance, you will find Stone Age as well. Cohabiting. It's a crazy, amazing country actually in some ways. And I'm saying this in a good way. But so Sambal had a village called Tamaria Ghat, and we had our friend there who was also interested in this, wanted to set up a school there. So he got the land. We put in our own money. We asked our friends and families, but more than that, we went out and asked it from people who would like to do something good. And turned out that there is no dearth of people. So there's a small amount of money that we collected from people who we know. We set the school up. My wife is an architect, and she is local materials architect. Community schools is what she does in villages. So she was able to design the building. So we really started without thinking that will happen, and it really happened during the COVID period. And just after COVID ended, we welcomed our first batch. There was a small pilot we did, however, I should mention, before COVID, because we wanted to be sure that there is indeed a need of education in the village, in the villages, and school kids really want to come. And now we have, it's a small school, 1 to 5, around 250 kids, very very meager fees, right? They pay like 200, 300 rupees or something. Some of them don't even pay, but we try to underwrite it. And if you really ask me, Yugank, what have you done in your life? Frankly, all of the other things that I told you was frankly not as interesting as this one. So this is what I'm really happy about. So thanks for asking. And if you are around the region, I'd love to have you visit us, talk to the little kids that we have, and see what's going on. And or maybe if there are friends there, please. It's just 3 hours from Delhi. Yes. Thanks a lot for asking.
So that brings me to the question I ask all my guests at the end of the show. Why do you do this work? And I'm referring here to your research and academic work and the dashboard that you mentioned.
Yeah. I think I am really doing it because I do this because I enjoy this. There is no goal or purpose. There's no philosophical drive that I think I have found or I want to tell you or tell the audience here. I just like it. And because I like it, I do it. If I don't like it, then I won't be able to do it. And, many people might say that, everyone does what they like, those who are doing it, right? Or many people, but there is a result, there is a goal orientation that many people have. I have it, but not as much. I think, as long as I think I'm adding value and meaning to me and people around me. That's great, as long as I'm liking it. So the fact that I enjoy it is really the prime driver. I was in a bank earlier, didn't quite like it. I joined academia and I loved it. I actually joined Jindal when they were buying land, right? So I was one of the early, the first batch in some sense, and so helped set that institution up. I really liked it. Then I liked academia. I moved to my PhD. I really liked it. Then I came back because I liked India. And then I did a project on gazetteers in Haryana and Karnal, and I really liked it. And I wanted to do more of it. And now I'm here and I'm doing this project, reading about politics. I like doing that. I like doing numbers, and I did this book. So I don't know, is that like too underwhelming an answer? I just like it. That's why I'm doing it.
Not really. I think that's actually refreshingly honest and reminds me of that line, "मैं जिंदगी का साथ निभाता चला गया."
Good one. I like that too.
Yugank, I can't tell you what a pleasure it's been to have you on the show. More importantly, it's been a deeply insightful look into India's electoral process and what needs to change. Thank you for that.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Ashraf. And I'll hope I will receive more comments and feedback on the book from you, and even from the listeners and everyone else. And of course, it's a huge. Here's an open invitation for anyone to visit Flame, see the work that we're doing, or to visit our school in whenever you happen to go into the hinterlands of Western Uttar Pradesh. Thank you so much, Ashraf.
Thank you all for listening. Please visit allindiansmatter.in, that's ALLINDIANSMATTER.in, for more columns and audio podcasts. You can follow me on Twitter at Ashraf Engineer, that's ASHRAFENGINER, and All Indians Count, that's ALLINDIANSCOUNT. Search for the All Indians Matter page on Facebook. On Instagram, the handle is All Indians Matter. Email me at editor@allindiansmatter.in. Catch you again soon.